want to apologize. We outfoxed ourselves trying to figure out when to start this. We thought votes would start sooner, but I appreciate the ranking member accommodating. We at least wanted to get started and afford the commissioner an opportunity to discuss things. So this committee meeting will come to order. Good afternoon. I know it's a very busy time at the IRS with less than a week left in the filing season. So I want to welcome the commissioner and thank him for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. I know this is your first filing at the IRS, and we are interested in hearing your observations and visions for the IRS. Speaking of the filing season, Congress provided an additional $397 million in the past 2 years to address system updates and needed new staff to help implement the 2017 tax law. However, in the weeks leading up to tax filing, we experienced the longest federal government shutdown since, which delayed hiring, training, and updating. I want to thank your staff and their dedication for their perseverance, and I'm curious to hear how the shutdown has impacted the filing season. The IRS makes up half our subcommittee bill. Under the previous majority, it has been underfunded for the last decade. Underfunded despite issues like tax evasion, elder fraud, and identity theft. So we want to reverse these trends and provide resources tied to results. Speaking of funding, the President's fiscal year 2020 budget request, $11.8 billion to discretionary appropriations, constitute an increase over current spending levels. The majority of the increases are to support the Operations Support and Business Systems Modernization account. Based on the IRS's 6-year integrated modernization plan, the IRS will dedicate $290 million of appropriated funds to update the legacy computing infrastructure. I hope you can share more details about IRS's modernization plan. I have a hunch you're anxious to do that. Your fiscal year 2020 budget request includes an additional $362 for program integrity cap adjustment that will provide $200 million to enforcement and $162 for operations support. Since 2011, the IRS's enforcement budget staff has been cut by 27%. As a result, the number of audits and investigations has been reduced, and most voluntary compliance rate, and the most recent compliance rate is only 81.7. These funds are needed to correct the downward staffing trend in enforcement. I know we have to prioritize and make tough choices within the funds provided, but by cutting IRS enforcement, what message are we sending the American people? Lastly, I'd like to remind us all of the IRS's mission to provide taxpayers with top quality service. We need to improve the taxpayer's experience by reducing wait time for callers, trying to resolve a tax issue, increasing support to programs that assist the elderly and low-income populations, and providing quality and timely resolutions to victims of tax identity. In closing, I want to thank Nina Olson, the National Taxpayer Advocate, for 18 years of service. She has been a champion of the U.S. taxpayer, provided insightful recommendations on how to improve the IRS and taxpayers' experience. We thank her for her service. That said, thank you again for taking time to meet with us today. We look forward to your testimony. Let me now turn to Ranking Member Graves for his comments.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, good to have you with us today. I want to first just congratulate you and all the employees that work with you at the IRS for the implementation of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that's been lowering the tax burden on Americans this past year, but I know things are going well. According to Secretary Mnuchin earlier this morning, he says things are on track and are in fact going well, so commend you and your team for that effort. I know one of your highest priorities going forward is the implementation of the Integrated Modernization Business Plan that provides a 6-year roadmap for achieving the necessary modernization of IRS systems and taxpayer services. I believe the operations of the IRS and the services provided to taxpayers can be improved. I know you feel the same way, and that's one of your great missions, and I look forward to working with Chairman Quigley to ensure that you have the resources necessary to implement. Now, during the previous administration, the IRS faced many management issues regarding wasteful spending on conferences, creating inappropriate videos, and targeting certain groups based on ideological beliefs. Certainly love to hear today from you how you've addressed some of these issues to ensure that they're not repeated in the future. And then finally this morning, Secretary Mnuchin said that the technology used at the IRS, and this is his quote, is embarrassing. And I think we all understand the challenges you have there. So your team maintains an enormous amount of sensitive business and personal information. Cybersecurity and identity theft have been a continuing challenge. for the IRS. So maybe today you could share a little bit about what you and your team are doing to protect your systems and all of our taxpayer information from the cyber threats that exist. But I'm glad to have you with us today. Appreciate your efforts, and Mr. Chairman, happy to yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Lowy, the chairwoman of the full committee, for any opening statements she would like to make.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Chairman Quigley and Ranking Member Graves for holding this hearing. Commissioner Reddick, welcome, and thank you for being here. Commissioner, you and I had a really good discussion in my office last week, and I admire your dedication to the IRS workforce and your clear desire to boost morale. Your personal history, including your family's commitment to our country, speaks volumes about your character. And so it disappoints me that your budget request is so unacceptable. It includes decreases that would impact my constituents who have already been targeted by the Republican tax bill. You include a $90 million cut to taxpayer services, which help taxpayers navigate their personal finances and the new tax law accurately. I frequently hear from taxpayers and tax professionals in my district that they can't even get in touch with an IRS representative for assistance, and these cuts would only make this worse. You also include a $155 million cut for base funding of enforcement resources that bring tax cheats to justice and ensure the system remains fair for all. However, I was very pleased to see that you requested a $140 million increase for business systems modernization, including $80 million for cybersecurity and data protection. As you know well, the IRS houses our most sensitive personal data and is therefore consistently targeted by nefarious actors. This is an issue of national security, and we must make sound investments that protect Americans and their personal information. I know that you implement the laws that Congress enacts, but I would be remiss not to raise the biggest threat New York faces when it comes to taxes, the cap on the state and local tax deduction. This is particularly harmful in my district, where Westchester and Rockland are already some of the most heavily taxed counties in the country, if not the. There was recently an article just this week. The cap is quite frankly insulting. New York's residents and businesses send more revenue to the federal government than it receives back in federal spending. In fact, a recently released report by the Rockefeller Institute of Government found that for 2017 alone, New York gave $35.6 billion more to the federal government than it received. It's unacceptable to further burden New York families, and I encourage you to work with us to find ways to ease the pain. I hope that you take these concerns seriously. I look forward to a productive discussion today, and I thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner, you're on. For the record, and without objection, your statement will be entered into the record. So if you could please keep your statement to 5 minutes. As you know, we're pressed up against votes again. But we're glad to have you. Thank you.
I understand and I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Chairman Quigley, Chairwoman Lowry, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the IRS budget and current operations. I'm truly honored to serve as the 49th Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. Having spent 36 years in the private sector representing taxpayers before the Internal Revenue Service, I understand how important a fully functioning IRS is to the overall success of our country. Our people interact with more Americans than any other institution, public or private. Our people make a difference, they care, and they take pride in serving taxpayers and our country. The IRS is important to every American, and every American is important to the IRS. I'm passionate about modernizing our information technology infrastructure and continuing to improve cybersecurity. I'm passionate about making sure our workforce receives the resources and training they need to appropriately serve the taxpayer community. We want to do more, and with your assistance, we will be better able to enhance the overall taxpayer experience. I'm passionate about helping all taxpayers with their filing and reporting obligations, but especially those in the underserved and ESL communities. Taxpayers who are willing to comply must receive appropriate levels of support and timely guidance while we respect their rights and forever safeguard their information. And I'm passionate about making sure we enforce the tax law. The IRS must continue to balance service to the taxpayer community with an appropriate degree of enforcement of our nation's tax laws. A robust enforcement effort assures compliant taxpayers that those who fail to comply risk the consequences of such noncompliance. I'm pleased to report that the 2019 filing season opened on time on January 28 and continues to go well. As of March 29, the IRS has received more than 92 million individual returns, and we have issued more than 71 million refunds for a total of more than $206 billion. Turning to the President's budget request, we are asking for an appropriation of $11.472 billion for the IRS in fiscal year 2020. This is $170 million, or 1.5% above the 2019 enacted level. This request proposes increasing funding in several critical areas. At the top of that list is technology modernization. We are finalizing our modernization business plan, which will cost about $2.3 billion to $2.7 billion over 6 years to help bring our critical IT systems up to date. The President's budget request includes $290 million in initial funding for our plan. Modernized systems are the key component to delivering quality service to taxpayers, providing efficient and robust enforcement activities, and keeping taxpayer data secure. The integrity of the nation's voluntary tax compliance system depends on modernized IRS, IT, and we look forward to working with Congress to implement this plan. Another critical area where we propose to increase funding involves the IRS's ongoing efforts to secure our systems and protect taxpayer data. Technology has greatly helped the IRS protect our computer systems from cyber attacks. It has also helped us in our ongoing battle to protect taxpayers and their information against tax-related identity theft. The funding called for in the President's budget is also important to our efforts to maintain a well-trained workforce. This is a critical time for us, given that a large percentage of our workforce is either eligible to retire or will become eligible in the next 2 years. To help us further in this area, we are asking Congress to restore Streamlined Critical Pay Authority, which expired in 2013. Without this authority, we have found we lose highly qualified candidates to other organizations that can hire them more quickly. Chairwoman Lowry, Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the dedication and support that Congress has shown to the IRS mission. I am committed to working with you to ensure the IRS can continue to fulfill its mission now and in the years to come. That concludes my statement, and I would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you. In consultation with the Ranking Member, Mr. Graves, we decided we were going to try to do Ms. Lowy and Mr. Graves' questions before we run off to vote, and if folks could get back as soon as possible, we'll commence again. Chairman Lowy.
Thank you. Commissioner Reddick, your FY20 budget request proposes a $155 million decrease for enforcement without including the integrity cap adjustment, which means less money to combat tax cheats. I'm struggling to understand this cut when enforcement staffing has been reduced by 27% since FY11. As I noted in my opening statement, cuts like this make it clear that this administration does not prioritize enforcement of the tax laws. Can you explain why your request cuts enforcement? And why is it that year after year the IRS requests to transfer tens of millions of dollars out of enforcement into other parts of the IRS? Don't you value enforcement?
Madam Lowry, Chairwoman Lowry, excuse me, as we discussed when I was in your office last week, I believe you understand I'm an enforcement person. I'm an enforcement-minded person. I believe that a strong, robust, visible enforcement presence by the Internal Revenue Service supports our voluntary compliance system. I think it supports the taxpayers who voluntarily comply. They need to know that those who do not run a substantial risk of being there. We're working hard on our systems with respect to data and analytics and the modernization plan to be able to be better able to take enforcement actions where appropriate. And I want to confirm to you, as well as to the other members of the committee, that personally I have both eyes focused on enforcement, and I would be glad to come back and hopefully be able to tell you where we've made great strides in that.
First of all, in addition to the eyes, I'm sure you would like some money to help you with enforcement. So I wish you'd think about it, and maybe we can change that. And I also briefly, because I know we're running out of time, the tax law, $10,000 cap on state and local tax deduction. You're a California native. Previously, no limit to deductions of state and local property and income taxes for those whom itemize. A major sort of tax fairness for high-tax federal donor states like New York, with 35% of taxpayers deducted more than $22,000. In my district, that number was even higher at 45% of my constituents conducting an average of $26,000. Simply put, the new tax law places an unfair burden on New York taxpayers who already send more to the federal government than New York gets back in federal investment. It's unfair to place the burden of Republican tax cuts on hardworking New Yorkers who already face high taxes and a high cost of living. What is the IRS doing to resolve this issue and provide relief to high tax states?
As an administrator of the tax laws enacted by Congress, the IRS is required to follow the law. The proposed regs came out, I think it was in August of last year, and the regs are in the process of being finalized, and I would anticipate within the next, I would hope within the next month or less, the regs will be finalized. And, you know, the IRS cannot change the tax law. The IRS has to administer the law. And being from California, I well understand your comments.
Well, I thank you very much, and maybe you can become an advocate for a change to where it was. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ms. Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. Are you familiar with the Voluntary Income Tax Assistance Program?
Yes,
Lita?
absolutely.
Having employed that when I was in law school myself, and my undergrad major being accounting, it used to the fact that it was helping low-income people who really need that refund and understand their taxes, prepare them properly, and get the money back in their hands. We have 9 such sites throughout my district at the moment. Do you think Congress is doing enough to give you the wherewithal to continue this program and to provide these services in the low-income areas around the country?
As I indicated in my opening statement, I'm a very strong proponent of taxpayer assistance to the lower income communities, the English as a second language communities, the communities of unrepresented taxpayers. I myself participated in VITA programs earlier stages in my life. Since I've been in Washington, D.C., I've participated in 2 separate lower income related, taxpayer related activities here that were, one was on a weekend, one was on the evening. So I'm very conscious of impacts in communities that are either unrepresented or lower income or people who English might not be their first language. And I think that VITA is a critical program for those. And I'm hugely supportive of the VITA program, as is the IRS.
Are we providing enough funding for you to continue the program?
You know, every function of the IRS could use additional funding, and VITA could use additional funding, and there is legislation pending.
With that, I yield back to my ranking member, Mr. Raves.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Joyce. Commissioner, a couple quick questions on behalf of the bipartisan delegation of individuals impacted by some natural disasters. I know that they have requested some assistance in a letter that was directed to your office. It was led by Mr. Dunn from Florida, and as you know, victims of natural disasters need assistance oftentimes during the filing season and calculating their taxes. Can you just tell us a little bit about what the IRS is doing to help victims of the 2018 and 19 natural disasters?
The IRS, I like to say the IRS is a large institution run by people, and it's run by people who care. And the IRS has a strong focus on natural disasters. And a lot of people, I wasn't aware before I came out, and a lot of people are not aware that over 9,000 IRS employees have participated in calls, over 1.6 million calls relating various disasters. And in the last hurricane down in Florida, 25 IRS special agents, criminal investigation went down and worked 7-day weeks, 12 hours a day, providing security. So we're very aware of that. I'm aware of your issue. We recently responded to another member of Congress on the same issue, and so we'll take a deeper look at it.
Are you considering using the cost indexes safe harbor method? I know that's something that they requested
I've seen the request. I'm not personally familiar with that particular method, but we will take a look at it and work with staff.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, yeah. From what I know, just a little I know, it appears to be one of the quickest and easiest methods since there aren't enough contractors to provide a lot of the estimates. Many of the residents still have to be able to settle up some of this, and so yeah, if you would take a look at it, that'd be great. And I know on behalf of everybody impacted in those areas, any assistance available would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
I come from earthquake country.
Yeah, I know you understand.
Natural disasters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Commissioner, we appreciate your indulgence, this pesky little constitutional requirement of voting. So if you will, the committee stands in recess until such time as required for members to cast votes on the floor. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We will reconvene. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for your indulgence. Sir, let me ask you about private debt collection to begin. It's been 2 years now this program's been in operation. The obvious concerns are we spent most of our lives telling people that the IRS wouldn't be the one calling you, so that it's potential for some confusion in this regard, particularly when it relates to scams and those that would prey on lower income or senior citizens or both. According to the National Taxpayer Advocate, 46% of taxpayers who have entered into an installment agreement to pay taxes owed had incomes below 250% of the federal poverty level. So if you could help explain how this is happening and what the IRS is doing to remedy the situation.
Thank you, sir. The private debt collection issue is the law, and as the law, the Internal Revenue Service is required to follow it. There is a proposal to reduce the figure from 250% to 200% of the federal poverty rate. And a significant issue that flows there is are individuals entering into installment agreements that result in a default because they're answering the phone and working out a payment arrangement with somebody based on the fact that that person's on the phone now. So again, as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, issues with respect to lower income and English as a second language communities are issues that are very near to me personally with respect to family-related issues and issues that we are focused on to try to make it work to the best of its abilities. And at the end of the day, we will follow the law, but we want to make sure that the program works effectively and does not unduly burden the communities that are being impacted.
So specifically, what do you do? I mean, there are folks out there that now know that calls can come from the IRS, and they're extraordinarily unscrupulous actors who are going to say whatever it takes. How do you prevent that kind of fraud? What are you putting in place to make sure those folks aren't used by such unscrupulous users of the system?
There's two issues in that. When matters are sent out to private debt collection, the taxpayer actually receives a written notice from the Internal Revenue Service indicating that it's being sent out to private debt collectors. And then the other side, in terms of people who call and the scams, and we're inundated with those situations in this country, and certainly during filing season, we're inundated with those situations. The IRS has done, puts out the 12. The dirty dozen, the 12 issues primarily that come up, and phone scams are always among the top on that. IRS Criminal Investigation is involved in numerous investigations of phone scam artists, not all of which are based inside the United States. Many of them are based outside of the United States. I think universally they prey on individuals who either have other issues, elderly, health care, and whatnot, and just have basically a fear of the government. So the IRS tries hard in terms of outreach. I thought they tried hard when I was on the outside in private practice, and I would see a lot of information come out. I probably didn't read as much of it as I do now, and it probably wasn't as sensitive to trying to make it as easily understood as I am now. I have a higher focus because I am inside and paying attention to the things that are out there. But outreach, education, constant notifications, and there are peaks for when the scam artists tend to come up, which filing season tends to be one of those peaks.
Have you quantified in this 2-year period if there has been indeed an uptick in the scams dealing with phones?
I have not. I've only been on board since October 1
well, I meant
of last year. No, I understand. 2 years for the program. Sorry about that. But I have not. But it's an issue I can look into and report back to you.
Yeah, we would appreciate that. I guess I'll go to Mr. Stewart. Is that correct, Mr. Graves? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, sir, it's good to have you with us. Again, I've said this in most of these hearings, that is the oversight role of Congress is important. And we have a specific role here. I know that makes your job harder sometimes as you prepare for these hearings. You're wondering, what will I be asked? And do I have all of the information? And I think it impresses me, the witnesses and the officials we have before us, their broad range of expertise and ability to kind of deep deep dive into their own agencies, and there's hardly anything we could ask them that they don't seem to have the answer for. I'm going to speak broadly if I could, and I don't think this will take much time, but we'll see. The IRS is an agency that's been bruised over the last 3 or 4 years. We go back previous to your time, obviously. There was a time when they were criticized for some inappropriate videos, as you may recall, some conferences that were very expensive, that seemed to be, more luxurious perhaps the American people expected. Of course, you look at them targeting certain ideological groups, the perception being that they had a different view than, some officials in the administration. They were targeted because of that. And now you're going to be in the middle of this firestorm over tax returns, which we've already discussed here, and I don't necessarily want to dive into. Can you answer 2 things for me? First is, do you feel like we've got a handle on some of the spending that was perceived as being wasteful, and probably was? And the second thing is, how is the morale of your agency, and how do you think that how do you think we could help with what is a real important function, and that is the American people voluntarily comply with most tax law? I mean, the foundation is built on voluntary compliance. How can we preserve that, the kind of ethos that, the IRS is an agency that many people are, it's not everyone's favorite agency for obvious reasons, but we still want to maintain that integrity of the agency. And give us your sense of where we are in that, if you would, please.
Well, Congressman, in significant part, I came on because of my respect for the IRS workforce, having been on the outside for 36 years, interacting with representatives of the Internal Revenue Service for my entire professional career. Respect the quality of the people who work there and their dedication and their care for the mission that they're trying to accomplish. And came into really tried to handle the issues that impact what people think of the Internal Revenue Service in this country on the outside, and to open up and make sure that people understand that we have an agency that 95% of the gross revenue of this country goes through the agency, that everything that's good in this country is in one way or another attributable to this agency, that the agency touches more Americans than any other entity, public or private. And I've done a lot of internal presentations. I've been down to Atlanta. I've been down to our service center in Austin, Texas. Next week I'm going to Kansas City. It's my intention to actually touch myself as many of the 80,000 employees as I can, to remind them that I'm here for them, that I respect.
I would invite you to Utah, where we have processing, although I imagine a smaller one, but there's one in Ogden as you.
I'm headed there.
Good.
I'm headed to Ogden. I don't anticipate my goal would be to touch every person at the IRS, shake their hand and thank them for the service that they've done on behalf of the country, and let them know that I am here for them, because I am here for the people of the Internal Revenue Service, as well as the tax-paying public, and as well as Congress, to make people aware. So from a morale perspective, I've been interacting directly with people of the Internal Revenue Service. We have a lot of communications that come out of the office of the commissioner, and those communications are written by me personally. We have a communications and liaison department, but I write them myself, and I tell the employees I write them myself. I want them to know who I am. I want them to know the feel of why I'm here, and the vision, my vision at least, for the Internal Revenue Service, and have an understanding of that throughout. And that's very important to me. On the spending side of the house, we're very conscious of spending-related issues. The IRS, I think, has to be efficient, has to be responsible, and it has to make do with the ultimate amount of money that is made available to the Internal Revenue Service. That it's very important for the integrity of the Internal Revenue Service. The voluntary compliance rate in this country is right around 83%. That's people who voluntarily file and pay their returns, pay their tax. If that percentage, because people believe less in the integrity of the Internal Revenue Service, drops 1 point, that's $30 billion a year. If we can raise the integrity of the Internal Revenue Service 1 point, that's another $30 billion a year. That's a $60 billion swing based on what the taxpaying public believes in the credibility and integrity of the Internal Revenue Service. That's what brought me on board. I came on board for that at this point in my life, in my professional career, in my personal life. I had the opportunity to do this, and I did it, and that's why I'm here.
Well, I would maybe just close with this point. If a 1% drop is $30 billion, we've had some probably $60 or $90 billion issues in the last couple of years. And again, I'm not pointing the finger at you or any one individual, but there's no question that the agency has, lost some of the credibility and some of the goodwill that was stored up there before. There are people like me who think, you know, they actually did target some of these groups, and they did it for ideological purposes. And those are the kind of people who would, you know, be, because of that feeling, would be resentful. And look, you don't have the, because of who you are, you don't have the latitude that other agencies might have when it comes to not just that, but some of the spending issues. So, you know, we encourage you to thank your employees for the good work that they do. We recognize it's essential, and we appreciate that. And continue to encourage them to value that integrity, which is absolutely irreplaceable and takes months or years to redeem it once it's lost. So thank you, sir.
And we are looking forward.
Yeah,
You know,
thank you.
we want things to be better for everyone.
Yeah, and that'd be better for all of us. Yep.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Commissioner, the IRS estimates that taxpayers pay collectively, as you just indicated, a bit more than 80% of owed taxes. And this difference accounts to roughly $450 billion a year. The Government Accounting Office has recommended that the IRS reestablish goals for improving voluntary compliance and develop and document a strategy that outlines how it will use its data to update compliance strategies to address the tax gap. This is highlighted in both the House and the Senate's FY2020 Financial Services Appropriations bills. What's the IRS specifically doing to reduce the tax gap?
Congressman, I believe the net tax gap is about $406 billion. The 458 is before the IRS enforced collection activity occurs, and the net is about 406. But as in any estimate, it's an estimate, and it's an estimate that is based on old data, not necessarily current data.
What are you doing to address it?
We are a best-in-class data warehouse, and we are using the data that we have and data and analytics and other avenues to come from an enforcement perspective. We're streamlining where we're looking. We're looking at some areas. There's been some issues in the past.
Let me ask you, the workforce has already dropped nearly 20% since 2011, with taxpayer services and enforcement hit particularly hard. Unfortunately, the FY20 budget request, even though it's better than FY19, continues to deprioritize enforcement and taxpayer services. These two functions not only assist taxpayers in fulfilling their obligations, which can be both stressful and confusing for many taxpayers, but it also helps to ensure compliance, accuracy, and lower levels of evasion, which ultimately helps lower the deficit, and it supports lower tax rates for all taxpayers. How is this sustainable? The tax code continues to grow more convoluted, and it seems that IRS has neither the resources to assist confused taxpayers nor the resources to go after those that are purposefully playing games with the tax code and defrauding hardworking taxpayers. Why is IRS not prioritizing taxpayer services and enforcement?
The IRS is prioritizing taxpayer services and enforcement.
You're not asking for the sufficient resources.
Well, at some point internally, and this is having come in from the outside in the IRS, it comes down to sort of a guns and butter analysis. We're looking to modernize the agency itself, and that's our #1 priority. We're in the process.
What's coming from the outside?
Pardon? My practice. I just got on board. Excuse me, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just got on board October 1st. I was 36 years in private practice on the outside, interacting with the Internal Revenue Service. We are in the process of hiring about 4,300 compliance personnel. We have 14,000 customer service representatives, which are essentially the phone assisters.
You think those people would be sufficient to address the, as you say, $406 billion in the tax gap?
I believe that we need not only personnel, we need to better use the data and the analytics that are available to us and the internal data that the Internal Revenue Service has, and we are taking a strong look at that.
Well, how can you better address that data without having personnel to do it?
Beginning with personnel is we also need training for our personnel, and reference the taxpayer advocate, her reports have continually addressed training related issues, which has been cut significantly since 2010. So we need a trained workforce. When we have a trained workforce in place, we'll be better able to quantify the actual number of people we need to bring on board, which you will hear from me when we get to that
Isn't
point.
the administration proposing to reduce the personnel, the FTEs, in the taxpayer advocate section?
I believe it's the attorneys in the taxpayer advocate that will be moving into chief counsel's office, but not the personnel itself. But I can look into that and get back to you. Okay. I interact a lot with the taxpayer advocate. I knew her before she became taxpayer advocate 18 years ago.
That was one of the most exciting innovations in dealing with the IRS over the last decade. The real involvement of the taxpayer advocate in helping taxpayers. And of course, the last two tax cycles, it's been diminished tremendously. Calls can't even be answered, and I mean, it's just been terrible. It seems like you would prioritize that. My time is about expired.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Graves.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, you know, recent news reports say, indicate that the IRS are issuing less tax refunds than in the previous year. In fact, I think it's like $6 billion in less refunds to the taxpayers. Some are very critical of that figure, and some from the other party actually point blame at the administration. Why is that? Why are there less tax refunds this year, a lower dollar amount than previous years?
Well, the Internal Revenue Service is a tax administrator, and we don't tend to message why and how behind the statistics and the information that we publish. I've read the articles on the outside have addressed issues with respect to withholding and whether people adjusted or didn't adjust withholding during 2018 with respect to the filing of those 2018 returns coming into this year. But as of March 29, we have issued $206 billion in refunds associated with 71 million separate refunds. And, you know, we're more or less on par with where we were last year. And so.
Right. I think it's safe to say that when individuals are paying less in taxes, then they're probably going to get less tax refunds. Or when you've doubled the child tax credit or you've doubled the standard deduction, you may not even have a tax liability at all. Therefore, you're probably not going to get a refund, or it's going to be less than previous. In fact, in one of these reports that was somewhat critical with a headline, later says, lower refunds don't mean Americans paid more in taxes, quite the opposite. Most workers paid less in taxes last year and saw higher take-home pay week in and week out. But for many Americans, a slightly higher paycheck doesn't quite have the same visibility as a single $3,000 check in March or April. So I would caution folks from looking at that headline as a negative. In fact, it's a positive. If $6 billion of less money is being sent to taxpayers, that means that $6 billion of more money that was in their pocket from the beginning and wasn't held for almost 12 months outside of their own pockets. So I do appreciate how you've been administering the tax code. I understand the answer to your question there. On a different note that I know you can address, because I've talked to you personally about this, and it's really about the culture of the IRS and the employees. And I think you brought in sort of a new approach, a new perspective, a breath of fresh air, openness. Maybe share with the committee your approach to the how you engage the staff at the IRS and how you've invested your time into them, and then also about some of the challenges you have from your open positions and hiring practices and opportunities that exist for the IRS.
Yeah, I from day one at the Internal Revenue Service, literally day one, October 1, sent an email throughout the entire service to 80,000 employees that was, as I said, written by me and walked through the fact that, and in brief, I'll say I believe I'm the only commissioner to have a son or daughter who is active duty United States military, who at the time that I was going through the process was serving in a combat zone overseas on behalf of our country. I believe I'm also the only commissioner who has a spouse who was not only a boat person, escaped from Vietnam at the age of 18, but lived in a refugee camp for 6 months, whose father was in a re-education camp for 3 years, 9 months in a communist country, and have used that for an explanation to the people inside the Internal Revenue Service as who I am, and have opened up far beyond that, that I care about people. I care about the people inside the Internal Revenue Service. I care about the people outside of the Internal Revenue Service, and I care about the reputation of the Internal Revenue Service, and I care deeply in terms of employment and onboarding. Being in the private sector up until October 1, if I was out somewhere and I met somebody that I thought would be a good addition to the firm I was practicing in, I could talk to them on Friday and they could start on Monday. I have since come to learn that the federal process is about an 8 or a 9 month process. We lose people who we try to bring on board who would be significant for us going forward, which is one of the reasons why in the current pending bill is streamlined critical pay would allow the Internal Revenue Service in the IT and the cyber world to bring on up to 40 people within a 4 to 6 week time frame. And by way of explanation, in this country, cyber is probably the #1 concern for most public or private entities. And there's 300,000 available cyber positions in this country with a 0% unemployment rate. So we need things like streamlined critical pay to get our people on board. It's critical for the operation of the agency.
Mr. Chairman, if I could close by saying this, the commissioner personally invests in the employees there and in fact enjoys lunch with them each day. I guess he's in the building, in the cafeteria with the employees, and I come to find out that the folks there that prepare the meals know that his favorite meal is in fact salad every day.
I eat in a community table in our cafeteria every single day, and anybody who wants to join me, including each of the members here, you're all invited to come over. Thursday is Turkey Day, Wednesday is wings, shrimp and grits on Tuesday, and but that's one of the highlights of my position here is the ability to sit with our employees from across the country, whoever's in the building, and I do that when I visit other IRS campuses as well. I'm very proud of interaction and of our employees. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Christ.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Commissioner, thank you for being with us today. Mr. Commissioner, in response to declining enforcement funds over the last decade, IRS audits are down about 42% from 2010 until 2017, according to a tax industry publication. This is troublesome because tax cheats obviously harm all of us. However, I'm even more disturbed that the decline in audits is not evenly distributed. With taxpayers making more than $500,000 per year, seeing a decline in audits of 69%, yet working families audits only dropped 36%. This clearly indicates a policy shift of some sort, cracking down on people who have little and going easier on people who are doing very, very well. Now, I know you've only been on the job for a few months, so surely not blaming you for this, sir. But I am concerned that the 0.7% increase requested for enforcement activities won't provide adequate resources to rebalance the enforcement. So IRS is treating the poor as fairly as the IRS is treating the rich. But this issue is broader than unfairly skewing audits away from the rich and toward the poor. I recently came across this map behind me on a website, ProPublica. It shows where audits are concentrated in America. And you're a tax lawyer, and I hear a very good one.
You talk to my children, huh?
Sir?
Sorry.
It's all right. So when you look at the map, you probably see a heat map of lower income filers. The data is clear on that. Going after the poor and letting the rich off the hook, terrible policy, I would argue. But there's more here that's disturbing. I want you to look closer at the map, if you would. And what else do you see, Mr. Commissioner? Does anything jump out at you?
I did not bring my glasses, and so I see a lot of, I understand what it is. I'm not sure I can read the caption,
right.
But you're going to say, I'm assuming that it's California in the bottom half of the country is where it's more shaded?
Yeah, and what I see is the Black Belt in the Deep South and the Mississippi Delta. I see the border region of Texas. the Desert Southwest, and California's Central Valley, and tribal areas of the Upper Plains and the Midwest. The map looks like the IRS is targeting Black, Hispanic, and Native American populations for audit. Is that the case?
No.
Disparate impact is an important way to identify racism in policies and procedures that may not deliberately or intentionally want to do so. That's why it is not good enough to say that the IRS doesn't consider race when making audit determinations. Sometimes in order to find racial discrimination occurring, you've got to sort of look back after the fact and analyze if the systems or the algorithms that may be in use would violate or could violate individuals' civil rights, even if you didn't mean to. If a fair lending compliance officer at a national bank, for example, would see an internal map that looked like this, they probably would be horrified. Even accidental racial bias is, this pronounced rather, would mean big trouble for a bank. How will the IRS improve or avoid explicit or implicit racial, ethnic, and tribal bias in audits going forward?
The IRS has no filters whatsoever that identify individuals by race, religion, or any other capacity. The IRS filters are based upon a scoring system for issues. And if I could explain, there's two parts, I believe, to your question. One is in terms of the map. In the world of the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Additional Child Care Credit,
yes, sir.
The IRS sends out correspondence letters, and that particular world has about a 25% what would be called an audit rate, because a letter goes out, therefore it constitutes an audit.
Right.
And the issue with respect to EITC, not to turn it around, but is one that we are working very hard on. It's a very complex part of the Internal Revenue Code.
Right.
And it's nearly impossible to, through third party or otherwise, identify what a qualifying child is under the EITC. And so we audit through a correspondence audit, but it's still an audit, but it's a less intrusive than a sit-down audit, but it's still an audit.
Yes, sir.
We audit about 25% of that, and even with our audit activity in that arena, the net post-audit is about for 2018, about $18.4 billion overpayment. And so that's an area that I would personally like to work with Congress a lot. We're going back to 1976 to see every issue that's been put forward with respect to EITC and maybe revisit, is there another look we can do at this? It's a very important social program.
Yes, sir.
A little over $6,000 of a refundable credit, even if somebody doesn't have it. So it's an incredibly important program for our country. We just need to figure out a way maybe to get it better for the people who are entitled to it. It has about an 80% participation rate, but it needs to be better for the people who are entitled to it, because I think it's $6,431 for a married couple, even if they owe no tax. I think that's really significant and something that we should all support. The other side of the same question is a lack of or a reduced audit rate in the world of the sort of higher wealth individuals, extremely wealthy, mid-wealthy, or people, $100,000, $150,000 on up, who may not consider themselves extremely wealthy, but they fall into that. In significant part, when I was talking earlier about restoring credibility and integrity to the Internal Revenue Service, one of my focal points is to get the audit rates up for the more wealthy taxpayers, not necessarily by targeting the taxpayers, but by taking a strong look at the issues that I'm aware of that wealthy individuals might engage in. The Internal Revenue Service has not done a great job recently in terms of pass-through examinations, partnerships and related entities, and a lot of wealthy individuals have one or more pass-through entities, and so it gets a little complex to audit. We're looking at ways to streamline those audits. We're looking at ways to ask particular questions. I made probably the first or second week on board.
Sorry, Mr. Commissioner, we need to
I'm done. Sorry.
move on. I appreciate your response to that, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
And for the record,
I'm available to meet.
Let's continue to work
I
together on
appreciate that. I just want to make sure
appreciate it.
others get their opportunities.
Yeah, I apologize.
No, you did fine, sir. Mr. Chris has asked that the ProPublica article he referenced, where in the USA are you most likely to be audited by the IRS? and tax notes, regional bias, and IRS audit selection. Without objection, they will be entered into the record. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response to the tax cuts, I want to follow up on that. In Jobs Act, the IRS and Department of Treasury produced new income brackets. Those tax withholding tables, due to inaccuracies in these tables, many taxpayers did not withhold enough during the year. And they're having now to pay, as they're filing, more in taxes because of the government's error in producing these new income tax brackets. I don't think that that seems fair. I want clarification on a recent opinion that the IRS now claims that if the taxpayer paid 80% of their tax liability, that they will be forgiven for any underpayment. In January, the tax liability threshold was 85%. So when did you decide to change the number to 80%, and how did you choose 80% as the new threshold?
The withholding tables associated with the Tax Act were revised in February 2018, and the revisions to those tables were made by career IRS employees. And then those revisions were, there's a Treasury Inspector General report and a GAO report that came out that approved the revisions. I'm not sure that it was the tables, but the IRS would say that it worked very hard to get the message out. They had paycheck checkup, a lot of news releases, a lot of outreach. Point in fact, probably doesn't reach most of the people. Working people are not going to necessarily look up an IRS news release. This is my impression from the outside.
I would not. If I wasn't in this business, I would not be reading your press
The average
release.
person doesn't search for the IRS. They wait for the IRS to, you know. So the IRS view would be that it did a lot in terms of outreach and education. The individual, hardworking individual on the streets who ends up preparing a tax return and owing tax would probably say, I didn't realize that there was a change. Might not even have realized that there was a change in the Tax Act, quite frankly. Right. In terms of the 85 to 80%, practice on the outside, people would let you know that there are contingents of taxpayers who intentionally underwithhold and who intentionally fail to pay their estimated tax payments. The penalty on that is it's actually called a penalty, but it's the interest equivalent.
But you know who those folks are.
They're not just limited to those folks, but if I could come back to the other piece, there are people who intentionally underpay because it's an interest component and they can make more on the money in their pocket.
Rich people.
Paying.
The people that I represent don't overpay.
Hey, you're correct.
I mean, don't underpay.
Correct.
They want to pay their taxes.
So the law was if you pay 100% of the last year or the 90% category of the current year, you had a safe harbor. And so given comments made about the withholding tables, notwithstanding GAO and TIGTA, the IRS reduced the safe harbor for people who ultimately paid to 85%, and then various practitioner organizations, including the AICPA, came out and said the 85 should be 80, and the IRS then reduced it again to 80 based on—
So where is it at?
80.
Okay, and who benefits from that? What tax bracket? People making minimum wage? People making—
It would be across the
just
board.
Above minimum wage?
If somebody, I believe that if somebody did not adjust their withholding according to the Tax Act, the 80%, they should be safe within that. I believe there would be few and far between. I don't have statistics. I've not done the math on that, but the intent was that people who have under withheld 20% or less would not have the penalty issue associated with it. And again, the penalty is an interest equivalent issue, but it's an area that we're sensitive to.
Well, absolutely, because from my perspective, the intent was to try to fool people that they were actually seeing a reduction when the tax scam was passed, when in reality they were not getting they were not getting a reduction in their taxes because they would have that liability at the end of the year. As it relates to SALT for Californians, the average Californian pays $18,438 in local state taxes, and the new tax bill the deduction is capped at $10,000. In 2015, my constituents in my district deducted over $682 million in state and local taxes. What are you seeing? What is the impact that you're seeing?
Yeah, I don't have statistics, but I'm born and raised 62 years in Los Angeles, and I'm understanding of the impact of the SALT limitations, and I don't have California specific or any other particular state.
Well, I'd like you to
specifics.
follow up on that with me.
We
if
will.
you
I'll
can.
work with you, and
Thank you.
I understand the issue.
And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Commissioner, nice to have you back.
Thank you.
I had a couple areas I wanted to ask you about. First, the program integrity cap adjustment. Included in the White House's fiscal year 2020 budget is a $362 million program integrity cap adjustment that, if we approve it, would provide an additional $200 million to enforcement and $162 million to operations support, and you're familiar with those. Can you explain to me what those are and why Congress ought to consider that proposal?
The enforcement is, as it sounds, enforcement, which, you know, we like to wrap the term enforcement also within compliance, because we have to have a strong, visible enforcement presence, which couples with telling the people who get it right that they're doing the right thing. So the people who are not doing it right need to understand the risk of not doing it right. The operations support is essentially the IT and related support for the enforcement side of the house. I think that if we were on the outside, the reports might actually match specific IT with a specific enforcement function, but the way the counting happens at the Internal Revenue Service, they separate those two out. So it's not, the operations support is not an overhead component, it's part of the enforcement component, but it gets separated in that manner.
So these are both to help increase collections and reduce tax cheats.
Correct, across the board.
Has the IRS implemented a program integrity cap adjustment before? And if so, can you explain how it has benefited the IRS and the U.S. taxpayers?
I don't have information on whether they have, but would certainly be willing to get back to your staff and work with your staff on that. I am a believer that the program integrity cap will help us, and there's going to be a lot of oversight on the use of the funds, and I'm also a believer in oversight for the IRS. I think that people understand and see where the funds are being spent, particularly Congress. It'll help us going forward. I also believe that the Internal Revenue Service and Congress are in this together. I don't believe it's our issue or Congress's issue. I think it's an issue we need to work on together.
I appreciate your attitude, I really do. So is that enough money? The additional $200 million to enforcement and $162 million to operations support. Is that enough?
It's, I think in the aggregate over a 10-year period, it's about $15 billion going forward. And I think that the figures that I saw that should return somewhere around $47 billion. My hope would be to come back at some point, although it goes well beyond my specific term. My hope would be to come back and show that $47 billion was a significant understatement. To Congressman Bishop's comment, if there's $406 billion net tax gap, why aren't we getting it?
Right.
I think that's a fair question for us.
All right. Now, you did say part of it goes to IT, and I wanted to follow up about that. IT modernization. You got some outdated hardware and software at the agency, don't you? I read that more than 45% of the IRS's hardware was past its useful life, and that a large percent of the software was 2 or more releases behind the most currently commercial available version. That's not a way to manage an agency. What's the plan to ensure that the hardware and software are updated, and can you explain why this hasn't happened up to now?
Up to now, and again, I was on the outside, but my impression of but I've learned a lot in 6.5 months. But up to now, essentially, because of funding and other issues, they've been patching and adding on certain applications to what they have. So they have 60 different applications. And at some point, you need to, even if it's a relatively used car, you need to trade in the old car and bring out the new car. The modernization system that's there. There's an executive summary that's been put out. The full plan, I think, will be put out in the near future. We would look forward to the opportunity to come in and sit with you and with your staff and walk through the entire plan. But what it will do is it's a service-wide system so that a taxpayer actually can call in and handle all of their matters at once. A taxpayer can actually go online and handle all their matters at once, radically increase the web apps applications that we have. It'll also radically enhance our enforcement abilities and make us a much more effective
How about
agency.
security? Are taxpayers' personal data at risk given the antiquity of some of the equipment you're using?
The information that I receive is that we're not at risk today, but old systems are a higher risk than new systems, and that, you know, at some point we're driving that car further than we should.
Okay, thank you, sir, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioner, I guess the big deadline's April 15th, but there's another one tomorrow, and I need to ask you. As you know, the chairman of Ways and Means requested the last 6 years of the president's tax returns, asking that they be returned tomorrow, April 10th. So I'm not going to ask you first what you're going to do or how you feel you should respond to this. First question is this your decision under the law and under the regulations, or is it somebody else's? And again, I'm referencing what we know about 6103 and Treasury Order 150-10, which predates 1955 Treasury Order, which is very similar, that suggests this is on you. And any decision to take away that delegation would require written, at the very least, written notice to the relevant committee chairman. Sir, is it your understanding this is your decision to make?
From what I've been seeing, that's the information that I'm receiving, and I saw the Secretary's testimony this morning. We are a bureau of the United States Treasury, and we are supervised by Treasury, and so we did receive the letter. We're looking into it and expect to respond.
And so I'll ask you, how will you respond?
We're working on it.
Sometime in the next 24 hours, we'll have a decision. And again, respectfully, is the decision yours, yes or no, sir?
I think that the decision, subject to the delegation order, the decision is mine with the supervision of Treasury.
What is your understanding what that means, the supervision? It's either, respectfully, it's either your decision or it's not.
I think that Treasury can deal with the authority on that issue, but I don't have specifics for you on that.
Has Treasury talked to you about this decision?
They've talked to me about the
Communicated
fact that
with you is perhaps the better way to add.
They're aware of the fact that we've received the letter. That's correct.
Has anyone at Treasury communicated with anyone at the IRS about that decision?
Counsel for the IRS has been interactive, and I had a brief discussion with the Secretary that we received the letter.
That conversation was just that you received the letter. Was there something beyond the fact that the letter was received?
No.
He didn't request you to act in a certain way?
No.
Didn't suggest that he was going to make the decision to you?
There was a discussion about, and that's what I'm saying about we're working on it. There was a discussion about who's going to handle the response.
And what was that? And what did the Treasury Secretary say?
There's no conclusion on that.
But it's your understanding that the call is yours under the Treasury order.
I read the same delegation order that you did, sir.
Right, and the fact that to rescind that would take written notification in at least 30 days.
But we are under their supervision.
Sure. And I'll ask you the same question. To your knowledge, has anyone at the IRS had any communication with anyone at the White House, information going back and forth in any way about this decision?
To my knowledge, absolutely not.
Okay. Is it your understanding that you have discretion under this sort of a request under the law, that you can decide whether or not to comply with a request under 6103 of the tax code?
I think it'd be inappropriate for me to identify what the understanding is with respect to that.
What have your legal experts told you? It's hard to imagine, sir, that they're going to say at 5 minutes till midnight, okay, what are we going to do? I would assume that you all have started to have these discussions. They would have given you some amount of legal understanding as to what your choices were and what the law says. Okay. Did they talk to you at all, or did you ask about whether you have discretion whether to respond or to comply?
I have not asked, and I think it'd be premature for me to speculate with you now.
Would it have been premature to ask them if you had discretion?
I have not asked.
But you have not made up your mind as to whether or not you have discretion at all, correct?
So I think at this point it'd be inappropriate for me to go beyond the statements that I've made.
Okay. Mr. Graves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, are you aware of any other time that the chairman of Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives has requested the personal tax return of an individual?
Personally, I am not.
And for what reason would a chairman of Ways and Means request an individual's tax return or entities related to an individual?
I don't speculate on why people ask for things.
In the letter from Chairman Neal, he says the committee is considering legislative proposals and conducting oversight. And that is their reason for requesting the individual tax return of an individual and corporations related to that person. Can you think of a legislative proposal that could be derived from looking at one individual's tax return or the entities they're associated with?
I think it'd be inappropriate for me to speculate.
I'm not on the Ways and Means Committee, and I don't keep up with what they're working on. I'm sure your staff does. I mean, if you've been informed of any legislative proposals they're working on that would require the evaluation of an individual's tax return in order for them to reach a conclusion of what to propose legislatively?
I am not.
Yeah, I'm not either. I mean, I know it's not for you to speak on, but it just seems like we have a chairman and potentially a party that is attempting to weaponize the IRS for political gain. And that's unfortunate because, as you stated, there's no other time that I can recall, and maybe you can't either. Even in your time outside of the IRS and more in the public practice, if you were, as a tax attorney, I mean, if you knew that the federal government was using the power of Congress to request an individual's tax return for public disclosure, how would you feel about that in the private sector?
It's probably inappropriate for me to, personal opinion.
Let's say this tax return is not produced by the deadline. What are the consequences?
Again, privacy and confidentiality provisions probably preclude me from having any discussions with respect to the issues there.
I actually have great admiration for your willingness to protect, no matter whom they are, whether I agree with them, disagree with them, like them, dislike them, but your willingness to protect an individual's privacy, and particularly with their tax returns. But I'm curious as to what arresting authority the chairman of Ways and Means has if this product is not produced. Are you aware of any? Have they threatened to use any force against you as commissioner?
Nobody's made any threats against me.
Have they indicated any actions they might take against you or Secretary of Treasury?
I have not received any information beyond the letter.
Well, thank you for looking at this very seriously, because I think this is an important time in the history of our country that we do not allow any political party to weaponize any form of our government against their adversary. That is a dangerous and dark time if that were to occur. And Mr. Commissioner, I appreciate your conversation today, all you're doing in the agency, how you're leading the people of the Internal Revenue Service, how you're creating a culture of service That is something we certainly seek for our constituents, and it's been good to spend time with you today. And thank you again,
Our
Mr.
people
Chairman.
work hard.
They do. They do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Just a follow-up to that, and then I'll go on to Mr. Bishop. Can you recall a time when the Treasury Secretary has ever been involved in a Section 6103 request?
Personally, not, but I just came on October 1st, but.
I was just curious if your legal staff had
Since October
talked to you about
1st,
that.
no.
But,
And I've not had that discussion with anybody.
all right, good. Mr. Bishop,
I've been focused on the employees.
I got that.
Is there any reason for you to believe that the Ways and Means Committee would not have a legitimate interest in monitoring the auditing and the enforcement of the law with respect to a sitting president?
Sir, I'm a tax administrator. We process, file, and things, and I don't put my thought processes into those who look at us and have oversight ability with respect to us.
Isn't it true that the Ways and Means Committee does have oversight of the administration of your agency, and that it would be legitimate grounds to request a tax return of a president or an individual, particularly with respect to oversight of potential conflicts of interest that the president might have?
Sir, the committee has oversight, and I don't put my thought process into the balance of the question that you asked.
Are you aware of any IRS rule, and you are charged with administering the Internal Revenue Code with your agency, that says that a tax return cannot be released if the taxpayer is under audit? Whether a taxpayer is being audited or not, is there any
Released by?
By the service when requested?
No.
Is there any reason, is there any prohibition in your regulation or in the law that would prohibit a taxpayer's return from being released simply because it's in the process of audit?
Sir, I believe it's inappropriate for me at this time to engage in a discussion as to what might be appropriate or inappropriate with respect to issues coming out of that letter. And as I said, the Internal Revenue Service.
I'm talking in general, not just specifically to that letter.
I understand that, but I think the reason.
If anybody's tax return is under audit, is there a rule that would prohibit that taxpayer from releasing it?
I think I've answered that question, no.
So if any individual, including but not limited to the president, uses as a justification for not turning over a tax return to the public or releasing it, using the fact that that taxpayer may be under audit, there's no IRS rule or regulation to justify that, is there?
Sir, I can't speak to any particular taxpayer's issue with respect to privacy and confidentiality issues. And the reason that we're probably having this discussion is based on the fact of the letter that was received. So it's an area that
that's
inappropriate for
speculation
me
as to whether or not that's the nature of my question, or the reason for my question.
Well,
my question
I
is
believe if
really
I didn't
to
receive the letter, we might not be having this discussion.
But there is no rule that would prohibit the release of a tax return because it's under audit.
I'm not aware of such a rule, and I believe I've answered that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Commissioner Reddick, in response to concerns about the inability of the IRS to answer taxpayer calls during tax season in a timely manner in recent years, Congress provided the IRS with $290 million in dedicated funding to improve the level of phone service for fiscal years 2016, 2017, 2018. This additional funding allowed the IRS to hire additional temporary telephone assisters, which helped those raise the phone level of service from 38% during the 2015 filing season to almost 80% during the most recent 2018 filing season. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But despite the fact the IRS has demonstrated with additional funding, it can provide taxpayers with the assistance they need during tax season, this administration's fiscal year 2020 request calls for reducing funding for taxpayer services by almost $90 million below the current level, and overall taxpayer services staffing by almost 2,200 full-time equivalents from fiscal year 2019 CR level, which the administration acknowledges would lower the phone level of service from 76% in fiscal year 2018 to just 68% in fiscal year 2020. Here's the question. Won't these dramatic reductions in funding and staffing for taxpayer services simply reverse the gains that we've made in recent years and leave the IRS unable to provide taxpayers with the assistance they need, particularly for next year's filing season when taxpayer and businesses will be coping with tax code changes?
Congressman, I can assure you that every person at the Internal Revenue Service, including myself, wants to do more. We want to do our best, and we want to have adequate tools to be able to do our best. We want to make you proud. We want to make the people of this country proud. That's our focus.
Me too, and thank you for saying that. But we're in the habit of disregarding budgets that come at us that we don't like, and we decide how much money gets spent. Wouldn't it make sense not to make those reductions?
Again, we will make do with what we're provided, but we want to do more, sir.
Well, I'm not going to torture you on that anymore. Commissioner, I thank you for coming here and providing us with your testimony.
Thank you. I appreciate
Yield back,
it.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Graves? Thank you. I know we all have tough choices, and I appreciate, Mr. Commissioner, the fact that you have been willing to meet with just about anyone who's out there, and I appreciate the spirit in which you're doing this. As I said, I know we all have tough choices to make, and we can disagree. I'm often asked by high school and college students, what should I read to prepare for a life in public service? When I think about the choices you're going to have to make in the next 24 hours, I would remind you what I tell them, and who am I to tell you, but a man for all seasons comes to mind, and Sir Thomas More. But God go with you in those choices, sir. We appreciate your being here, and all for those who were responsible for this. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.
Thank you.